It all began with a moment of stillness, a rare pause in the chaos of daily life that made me ask myself one question. What if just 1 week could change everything? Not a year, not a month, just 7 days. The thought seemed ridiculous at first. Who really believes that a few tiny shifts can completely transform your world? But something inside me was itching for a breakthrough, something beyond the endless cycle of waking up tired, pushing through a day that felt like a copy-paste from the one before, and falling asleep to the hum of distractions I never chose. So I made a pact with myself, not a dramatic overhaul, but an experiment in discipline and intention. I would try 7 habits 1 week. I'd commit fully and honestly, and observe the outcome like a scientist watching a strange reaction in a lab. And I meant it. I woke up on Monday morning with a different kind of determination buzzing in my chest. It wasn't fueled by caffeine or external motivation. It came from the quiet belief that I owed myself more clarity, more presence, more control over how I live my life instead of letting life happen to me. I got out of bed with the decision to start the day before the day started me. The first change I committed to was waking up early. And let me tell you, I wasn't a morning person by any stretch of the imagination. My bed had been my sanctuary, the place where I postponed reality with the snooze button as my shield. But this time I set my alarm for 5 a.m. No excuses. When it rang, it felt like my body had been ripped from another dimension. I sat up in the dark, groggy and slightly irritated at my past self for thinking this was a good idea. But I got up anyway. No phone, no emails, just silence and the crisp, cool air of a world not yet awake. That first hour was jarring, but something shifted on day 3. I started to notice the difference. The quiet wasn't eerie anymore. It was sacred. I heard the birds before the city noise drowned them out. I saw the sunrise paint the sky in ways I never noticed before. It wasn't just beautiful, it was grounding. I stretched, lightly jogged around the block, and felt my breath return to me in a way that felt earned. This wasn't a schedule dictated by deadlines or alarms. It was me, reclaiming my own rhythm. With those morning hours, I carved out something I hadn't felt in years. Space. Not empty space, but sacred space. Time that felt like it belonged to me and only me. I began my days intentionally, writing down my goals in a quiet notebook and sipping coffee without scrolling through a digital void. That slow, mindful beginning had a ripple effect. I wasn't rushing out the door, mentally 3 steps ahead. I was present, and that presence carried into everything else, from how I answered emails to how I held conversations. It was like adding a layer of purpose to my entire existence. The second habit I folded in was daily movement. And here's the truth. I'd spent too much of my life on and off the fitness bandwagon, starting with enthusiasm and quitting with excuses. But this time, it was different. I didn't aim to transform my body. I wanted to reconnect with it. I promised myself just 20 minutes a day. That's it, not a shred more. And I stuck to it. I danced to music in my kitchen, took long walks after dinner, tried beginner yoga with trembling muscles and shaky balance. It didn't matter how messy or awkward it looked. It mattered that I showed up. One afternoon, I went for a slow jog, not to break records, but just to feel my feet on the ground, the wind on my face, the pulse of my heartbeat reminding me I was alive. Something happened during that jog. My mind, which usually ran faster than my feet, started to slow down. It matched my breath, my steps. I started feeling present in my body for the first time in forever, like every stride was a full sentence in a letter I was writing to myself. By the 4th day, my mood began to shift. I wasn't just moving my body, I was moving energy, frustration, worry, self-doubt. They all started losing their grip. Exercise became a kind of therapy, not the punishing kind filled with gritted teeth and forced reps, but the gentle kind, the kind that invites you back to yourself. And when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see progress in pounds or inches. I saw a person who showed up, and that in itself was transformation. Then came journaling, not the diary kind where you recap what happened. I went deeper. I made space at night to sit down with a pen and paper and just unload. At first, the words came awkwardly, as if my thoughts didn't know how to present themselves outside my head. But as I kept going, they started pouring out. Not perfect, not poetic, just real. My fears, my insecurities, my dreams, my wins, no matter how small. I wrote it all down, and something cracked open. There's power in reflection, in seeing your own thoughts outside of yourself. One night, I wrote about a conversation I had with someone that had left me angry. On paper, I broke it down. What they said, what I felt, and what part of it was really about me. By the end of the page, my anger had softened into understanding. That's what journaling gave me. A mirror, a filter, and a release all at once. I started noticing patterns. How I handled stress, how I avoided discomfort, what truly made me feel joy. I tracked my tiny wins. Getting out of bed on time, cooking instead of ordering out, resisting the urge to doom scroll. And I wrote down 3 things I was grateful for each night. At first they were obvious. A sunny day, good coffee, finishing my to-do list. But over time they became more nuanced. The way my mom laughed at her own joke, the feeling of clean sheets after a long day, the way my body carried me through the hardest workout without complaint. Gratitude wasn't something I listed anymore. It became something I lived. The 4th habit was mindful eating. And before you roll your eyes and think, here comes another clean eating lecture. Let me tell you, it was nothing like that. It wasn't about what I ate, it was about how I ate. For the first time in years, I stopped eating in front of a screen. I sat down, lit a candle, and just ate, slowly, deliberately. I noticed the texture of the food, the flavor of each bite. I noticed when I was full, something I'd lost track of in my usual rush. I remember one morning vividly. I made oatmeal with cinnamon and honey, sliced some bananas, added walnuts on top. I sat by the window and ate in silence, chewing slowly, feeling the warmth of the bowl in my hands. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't eating to fill a void, I was eating to nourish. It changed everything. I started to understand my body's signals better. I didn't eat out of boredom or stress. I didn't finish my plate just because it was full. I tuned in, and when I slipped, which happened, of course, I didn't shame myself. I just noticed. The difference between unconscious snacking and intentional nourishment was night and day. My digestion improved. I had more energy. But more than that, I felt like I was respecting myself again, choosing to listen to my body instead of ignoring it or stuffing it with distractions. This mindful approach spilled over into other parts of my life. I became more intentional about the content I consumed, the conversations I had, the way I spent my evenings. Everything slowed down, not in a boring way, but in a beautiful, enriching way. Life stopped feeling like a race and started feeling like a dance, one where I was finally hearing the music. And perhaps that was the biggest realization of all, that the transformation I was seeking wasn't in some grand overhaul. It was in the tiny, consistent decisions I made to treat my time, my energy, and my attention like the treasures they are. Waking up early, moving my body, writing my truth, savoring my meals. None of these habits were flashy, but each one was a doorway, and I walked through them, one by one, into a version of myself I hadn't met before. By the time I reached the 5th day, something curious started happening. It was like the air itself began to shift, not in a mystical way, but subtly, as if the universe was leaning in, listening to my efforts. The chaos I was used to navigating on autopilot didn't feel so loud anymore. Not because the noise outside had stopped, but because I had started to tune inwards, listening more to the steady rhythm I was building inside myself. My mornings weren't just a series of tasks to tick off a list anymore. They felt like rituals, and in those rituals I began to find a center, a space inside me that didn't shake with every wave of stress or uncertainty. One of the most impactful changes I didn't expect came from something deceptively simple: silence. I started carving out time each day where I didn't listen to anything. No podcasts, no music, no notifications buzzing in my ear. Just me, just silence. And it was uncomfortable at first, like standing alone in a dark room waiting for your eyes to adjust. My brain, used to constant noise, rebelled. It itched for distraction, but I held my ground. 10 minutes, then 20. I'd just sit, eyes closed, breathing, not trying to do anything or be anyone. And slowly that silence began to feel like home. Within that quiet, I started to hear the things I'd been avoiding. My real thoughts, not the ones masked by busyness, but the raw, unfiltered ones. Doubts I never voiced, hopes I'd hidden, regrets I'd buried. It was like opening a drawer I hadn't dared touch in years. But as I listened, I realized something powerful. I wasn't broken, I was just busy. Too busy to notice that so many of my struggles weren't due to my life falling apart. They were due to me being out of alignment with myself. That silence, uncomfortable as it was, started to stitch me back together. Alongside this, I introduced the habit of reading, not the skim through the headlines kind of reading. I chose books that fed my mind and expanded my heart. I read slowly, pen in hand, underlining lines that felt like they were written just for me. I remember one quote that hit me hard: "You will never change your life until you change something you do daily." That sentence became a compass. I saw how much of my identity had been shaped by habits I never consciously chose. The mindless scrolling, the emotional eating, the procrastination disguised as perfectionism. And now with every page I read, it was like I was rewriting the story I told myself about who I was and what I was capable of. Books became more than just sources of knowledge. They became companions on this journey. Each one whispered truths I'd forgotten, reminded me of the resilience within me, and challenged me to ask better questions. What do I really value? What kind of person am I becoming with the choices I'm making? What am I pretending not to know? These weren't easy questions, but they were necessary ones. And as I kept asking, my inner dialogue began to change. The voice that used to criticize me now spoke with curiosity and compassion. Another practice I began to cherish during this journey was intentional breathing. Something we do thousands of times a day without thinking, but when done with awareness, it became transformative. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, whether it was a crowded inbox, an unexpected conflict, or just a random wave of anxiety, I paused and took 5 slow, deep breaths. In through the nose, out through the mouth. It sounds too simple to matter, right? But in those few seconds, I reclaimed control. My thoughts slowed down. My heart rate settled. It was like I was gently telling my nervous system, "You're safe. We've got this." That breath was my anchor, especially on the days when doubt crept in. And believe me, it did. There were moments where I questioned everything, where I felt like an imposter trying to build a life of intention when my past was littered with inconsistency and broken promises to myself. But then I breathed, and in that breath I'd remember, I'm not my past. I'm the choices I make today. And today, I choose to show up. The more I practiced these habits, the more I noticed how everything was connected. The quality of my sleep improved because I wasn't overloading my system with junk food and digital noise late into the night. My focus sharpened during the day because I wasn't drowning in caffeine and anxiety. My relationships deepened because I was listening more, reacting less. Every change reinforced the others, like threads weaving into a stronger fabric. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something, slowly, deliberately. And then came one of the hardest but most rewarding shifts: digital discipline. I realized how much of my time, my life, was leaking through the cracks of endless scrolling. It wasn't just the time I was losing, it was the attention, the clarity, the creativity. I'd reach for my phone without even thinking, only to look up 45 minutes later, feeling more disconnected than before. So I made a bold move. I deleted the apps that weren't serving me. Not forever, just for this experiment. I turned off notifications. I created time blocks for when I could check messages. It was like decluttering my brain. At first, it felt like withdrawal. I'd grab my phone instinctively, only to stare at a blank screen. But within days, something incredible happened. My attention span stretched. I stopped living in a constant state of FOMO. I started noticing things. The way sunlight filtered through the trees, the sound of my neighbor's laughter, the ideas that bubbled up during a quiet walk. My mind began to breathe again. And in that space, I found something I didn't know I'd lost: inspiration. I started journaling differently, not just about my day or my feelings, but about ideas, projects I wanted to create, conversations I wanted to have, things I wanted to learn. My brain, no longer numbed by noise, became fertile ground for imagination. I sketched out a plan for a side hustle I'd been postponing for years. I wrote letters to people I'd never had the courage to thank properly. I recorded voice memos of insights that came to me out of nowhere. It was as if the silence I had feared was actually the birthplace of my next chapter. And through all of this, I kept returning to gratitude, not as a chore, but as a lifeline. Every night, I wrote down 3 things I was grateful for, but I didn't stop there. I added why. Why did that moment matter? Why did it touch me? That small addition turned a list into a meditation. I'm grateful for the stranger who held the door for me, because it reminded me that kindness still exists in the world. I'm grateful for the smell of rain on dry earth, because it made me feel connected to something bigger. These weren't grand events, but they filled me with a quiet joy that no achievement ever could. I realized that joy isn't something we chase, it's something we notice. And noticing requires presence. The habits I was practicing, waking up early, moving daily, eating mindfully, journaling, reading, breathing, they were all just different doorways to the same destination: presence. And with presence came peace. Of course, not every moment was magical. There were setbacks, days I didn't feel like moving, mornings when I hit snooze, nights when my mind spiraled back into worry. But the difference now was that I didn't let one off day derail everything. I'd built enough momentum, enough trust in myself to keep going. And that's when I understood the true power of habits. They aren't about perfection, they're about identity. Every time I followed through on one of these practices, I wasn't just checking a box. I was casting a vote for the kind of person I wanted to be. And over time, those votes added up. By the 7th day, I looked in the mirror and saw a face that hadn't changed much on the outside. But something was undeniably different. My eyes were clearer, my posture straighter, my energy calmer. But more than that, I knew myself in a deeper way. I had spent a week listening instead of numbing, acting instead of reacting, creating instead of consuming, and it changed me. What surprised me most was how the world responded. Not because I announced my transformation to anyone. I didn't, but people noticed. They asked if I'd done something different. They said I seemed more grounded, more present. And the truth was, I was. Not because I'd achieved something massive, but because I'd finally come home to myself. The voice that used to be full of self-judgment had softened. The mind that once felt scattered now had direction, and the heart that had been weary was beating with hope again. I wasn't perfect, I wasn't finished, but I was awake, and that, I realized, was the most powerful kind of transformation. Not the one that changes your appearance, but the one that awakens your soul. The momentum had taken hold of me in a way I hadn't expected. By the 8th day, I wasn't dragging myself into these new routines. I was stepping into them with a strange kind of reverence. Something inside had shifted. This wasn't just about forming habits anymore. It was about returning to who I was before the noise, before the world told me who I should be. And there was something incredibly liberating about that. I began waking up before my alarm, not out of anxiety or restlessness, but from a genuine sense of curiosity. I wanted to see how the day would unfold if I met it with presence. The first few minutes of the morning had become sacred. There was no rush, no screen glaring into my eyes, no emails begging for my attention, just stillness. I'd sit with my coffee, sometimes in the dark, wrapped in a blanket like a monk in quiet contemplation. It was the most peaceful I'd felt in years. Those early hours, so often wasted or ignored, were now mine, and in them, I found clarity. One of the most powerful realizations during that time was how much I had been outsourcing my joy, waiting for circumstances to line up perfectly, waiting for validation, for some external marker to tell me it was okay to feel good about life. But in the stillness, in the routines I was now living, joy stopped feeling like a distant goal. It became a byproduct of simply being present with what I already had. I started noticing the way sunlight spilled across the floor, the way a warm shower felt on my skin after a cold morning walk, the comfort of breathing deeply without rushing to the next moment. And the more I noticed, the more life offered. It was as if joy had always been there, waiting for me to slow down enough to see it. There was one morning in particular that stayed with me. I was out for a walk before the world had fully woken up. The sky was that gentle shade of gray just before dawn breaks open into color. The streets were quiet, and the air had that crispness that feels like it could slice through all the mental fog you carry. And in that moment, as my feet moved and my breath synced with the rhythm of the steps, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: wholeness. Not because everything was perfect, but because I wasn't trying to be anywhere else. I wasn't stuck in the past or rushing toward the future. I was just there, alive. And that was enough. I began to see that the real transformation wasn't in the habits themselves, but in the way those habits were reintroducing me to myself. I wasn't just building discipline, I was reclaiming agency over my own life. Every time I made the choice to move my body instead of scroll endlessly, to read instead of binge watch, to journal instead of complain, I was saying, I'm the author of this story. And let me tell you, there is no feeling more empowering than realizing you get to choose what kind of character you're becoming. Now, of course, there were moments of resistance, days when old patterns tried to creep back in, whispering temptations like, just one day off won't hurt, or you've been doing so well, you deserve to take it easy. And sometimes I listened, but the difference now was that I did it consciously. I didn't fall into the trap. I stepped into it with my eyes open. And because of that awareness, it didn't derail me. In fact, those moments of misstep became some of the most powerful reminders of how far I'd come. Because I didn't spiral, I didn't give up, I simply returned. And that act of returning, again and again, became its own kind of victory. Journaling had deepened by this point. It wasn't just about dumping thoughts onto a page anymore. It had evolved into a mirror. I would ask myself questions and wait for the answers to rise from a deeper place. Not the hurried mind full of lists and worries, but the quiet voice underneath it all. The one that rarely gets a chance to speak in our noisy lives. That voice started to sound clearer, more confident, less afraid. And with every word I wrote, I felt like I was building a bridge to my inner wisdom. The kind that doesn't shout, but whispers truth if you're willing to listen. One night, after a particularly emotional day, I found myself sitting with a journal entry that read, "I forgive myself for believing I had to be perfect to be worthy." And I stared at that line for what felt like hours. It hit something tender in me, something I hadn't realized I was still carrying. The endless striving, the self-judgment, the belief that I had to earn rest, earn love, earn peace. But in that moment, I felt the weight of those lies begin to lift. I didn't need to prove anything. I just needed to be real, with myself, with others, with life. As I let that truth sink in, it began to ripple out into how I showed up for the world. My conversations changed. I wasn't trying to impress or perform anymore. I was listening more, speaking less, and when I did speak, I made sure my words were rooted in honesty. Vulnerability stopped feeling like weakness. It felt like strength, like courage, and people responded to that. Connections deepened, laughter became more frequent. There was less need to defend or convince, just a quiet confidence that I was enough as I was. Sleep, too, had become a sacred ritual. I began to approach it not as the end of the day's chaos, but as a transition, a soft landing into restoration. I stopped bringing my phone to bed. I dimmed the lights earlier. I created space between my day and my dreams. And in doing so, I started to sleep better, deeper. Waking up didn't feel like a battle anymore. It felt like an invitation to live intentionally again and again. Nutrition was another layer I hadn't expected to shift so dramatically. I stopped eating for distraction and started eating for nourishment. I noticed how different foods made me feel, not just physically, but emotionally. When I ate clean, simple meals with care, my energy was stable, my mood lifted, my cravings quieted. And when I slipped, I didn't punish myself. I just listened. What was I trying to avoid? What emotion needed attention? Food became less of a coping mechanism and more of a dialogue. And in that dialogue, I found balance. By the 10th day, something surprising had happened. I no longer felt like I was doing a challenge. This had stopped feeling like effort. It had become identity. I didn't have to force myself to wake up early. I wanted to. I didn't need to be convinced to go on a walk or read or journal. These things had become part of me. And that's when it really hit me. Transformation doesn't happen through massive, dramatic changes. It happens in the quiet moments when you choose alignment over autopilot, when you choose to return to yourself again and again, no matter how many times you drift. Even my relationship with time began to shift. I stopped saying things like, "I don't have time." Instead, I started saying, "It's not a priority right now." That simple change in language was a mirror, and sometimes I didn't like what I saw. But it forced me to own my choices, to take responsibility for what I was creating with each passing hour. And from that place, I found a kind of freedom. I was no longer a victim of my schedule. I was its architect. And here's something else I didn't expect. People started asking me what I was doing, not because I'd posted about it or made a big deal, but because they could feel the change. They said I seemed lighter, calmer, more focused, and I would smile because I knew the answer wasn't some secret formula. It was simply showing up, repeatedly, intentionally, with love. There was one conversation I had that brought me to tears. A close friend looked at me and said, "It's like you're finally yourself again." And that wrecked me in the best way, because they were right. I wasn't becoming someone new. I was unlearning who I wasn't, peeling back the layers of performance, fear, distraction, and finding underneath it all a version of me that had always been there, quietly waiting to be remembered. That night, I sat in my room, candles flickering, journal open, and I wrote, "Thank you. Thank you for staying when it was hard, for believing in this path, for not giving up when it felt pointless. Look what we've built." And I meant every word. The journey wasn't over. It never really is. But I had crossed a threshold. I had proven to myself that change is possible, not because of willpower, but because of presence, because of intention, because of love. And now that I'd tasted that, there was no going back. There's a peculiar kind of magic that begins to unfold when you stop chasing transformation like a finish line and instead start treating it like a companion. Not a battle to win, but a relationship to nurture. That's what the following days began to feel like. A quiet, deepening connection to the process itself. I wasn't sprinting anymore. I was walking beside my progress, hand in hand, listening to it breathe, letting it teach me in whispers. And I began to notice that everything I once thought was mundane started to glow with a new kind of energy. Making the bed, washing dishes, organizing a drawer. These weren't chores anymore. They were sacred acts of reclaiming control over the chaos, tiny affirmations that my life mattered enough to be tended to with care. The act of cleaning my physical space turned into something spiritual. There was something deeply therapeutic about throwing out what no longer served me. Old clothes that I kept for reasons I couldn't even remember. Notebooks filled with half-finished thoughts from a version of myself that no longer existed. Even digital clutter, emails that went unanswered for years, screenshots I'd forgotten I'd saved, tabs that felt like open wounds on my browser. Every delete, every discarded thing felt like exhaling. It was like I was telling the universe, I'm making space, not just in my room, but in my life, in my heart. And that space, it didn't stay empty for long. It filled with clarity, with peace, with new ideas that had been waiting to breathe. There was a particular morning that stood out from the rest. The sun had barely risen, and I was sitting on my floor, stretching, feeling the stiffness in my body melt into movement. A song was playing softly in the background, instrumental, no lyrics, just a gentle piano drifting through the air. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I needed to be anywhere else. Not in the future, not in the past. Just there. That moment held me like a mother would hold her child, without judgment, without agenda, just presence. And in that presence, I felt whole. I wasn't lacking. I wasn't striving. I was simply enough. People often talk about purpose like it's this grand, elusive thing, a destination you arrive at once you've gathered enough accolades or suffered enough hardship. But what I was learning, what was becoming undeniable, was that purpose isn't found in the grand gestures. It's found in the consistency of showing up for yourself every single day. It's in how you greet the morning, how you speak to yourself when no one is listening, how you treat your body, not just when you're trying to fix it, but when you're simply learning to love it. And in those small, repetitive acts of devotion, you start to remember that you are not here to be perfect. You are here to be real. And being real, being deeply, unshakably authentic, that is a purpose in itself. Around this time, I had started reading more books again, something I had lost touch with. Not books about success or hustle or productivity, but stories, fiction, memoirs, words that held emotion like water holds sunlight. I found myself drawn to the quiet details in them, the pause between a character's breath, the way a sentence could land so softly and still crack something open in your soul. And it made me realize how much of life I had been rushing past, always chasing the next thing, always looking ahead. But now I was learning how to linger, how to dwell in the beauty of now. even if the now wasn't dramatic or extraordinary, especially then. There was one evening when it rained, not a storm, not something fierce or cinematic, just a soft drizzle tapping against the windows like a lullaby. I turned everything off, the lights, the phone, even the background music, and I just sat there watching the drops streak down the glass. And I cried, not because I was sad, but because I felt so tenderly human, so deeply present with myself that my body didn't know what to do with the fullness of that moment except let it spill out of my eyes. And it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, sacred, healing. Meditation had also become a part of my life, not in the traditional, perfectly still way, but in moments. I meditated while sipping tea, while walking in silence, while folding laundry with intention. I stopped trying to clear my mind and started simply noticing it, watching the thoughts rise like bubbles, some light, some heavy, all fleeting. And in that practice of witnessing, I began to understand that I was not my thoughts. I was the space they moved through. That realization alone, simple as it sounds, was like finding an anchor in a storm I didn't even realize I was in. There were still days when it felt hard, of course. Days when the old patterns knocked at the door, wearing disguises. Procrastination dressed up as self-care. Avoidance pretending to be rest. But now I could see them more clearly. Not with shame, but with compassion. Like, ah, there you are again. I see you. And just by naming them, they started to lose their grip. I didn't have to fight them. I just had to stay rooted in awareness. And that, more than any dramatic action, was the revolution. Conversations with others began to feel different too. I wasn't trying to be the most interesting person in the room anymore. I was more interested in listening, in asking better questions, in really seeing people. And something incredible happened when I stopped performing. Others began to open up more too. There was this gentle unfolding in my relationships, like flowers blooming under the warmth of authenticity. We started talking about real things, fears, dreams, regret, hope. And those connections fed something in me that had been starving. We don't need more surface, we need more soul. And I was finally learning how to offer mine unapologetically. Even my relationship with failure began to change. I stopped seeing it as something to avoid and started seeing it as feedback, a redirection, a nudge from life that maybe there's a better way. I remembered a quote I had once read, "Failure is not the opposite of success, it's part of it." And that lived in me differently now. It wasn't just something I believed intellectually, it was something I had embodied. I had failed so many times before, at routines, at boundaries, at being consistent. But here I was, not broken, not behind, just human, still learning, still moving. There was also this increasing trust in timing. I no longer felt the need to rush things, healing, growth, decisions. I understood now that life doesn't unfold according to our calendars. It moves at the pace of readiness. And my job wasn't to control the timing, it was to stay open, to stay willing, to keep showing up even when the results weren't instant. Because something was always happening beneath the surface, like seeds in the soil, invisible progress, quiet blooming. During one particularly still night, I remember sitting under the stars, thinking about how much of life happens in silence. The most important moments, birth, death, falling in love, heartbreak, they rarely arrive with fireworks. They come quietly. And it hit me then. Maybe that's why we miss them, because we're too busy looking for noise. But now I was listening, and what I heard was everything. That's also when I noticed a beautiful paradox. The more I slowed down, the more I got done. Not because I was working harder, but because I was working smarter. More intentionally, with focus and clarity. Instead of juggling 10 things and finishing none, I would do one thing at a time and do it well. And at the end of the day, I didn't feel drained. I felt fulfilled, satisfied, like I had actually lived through the hours instead of just survived them. Evenings had their own flavor now. I stopped filling them with distractions and started savoring them. Reading by candlelight, taking long showers while listening to calming music, writing letters I'd never send just to get the truth out of me, watching the sky shift colors without needing to document it, just living it. And in those quiet evenings, I found a kind of love I had been searching for in all the wrong places. The kind that doesn't need to be loud to be felt. The kind that whispers, "I'm here, you're okay, keep going." There was one journal entry from that time that still gives me chills when I read it. I wrote, "I no longer want a life that looks good. I want a life that feels good, even if no one else sees it." And that was the turning point. That was the moment I stopped living for the applause and started living for the alignment, for the peace that comes when your inner world finally matches the outer one. And that kind of peace, you can't fake it. You have to build it, one choice at a time. By then, even setbacks felt different. They didn't undo me. They taught me. When I skipped a routine or gave in to an old habit, I didn't spiral into self-hate. I asked, what do I need right now? And that one question changed everything, because it turned failure into curiosity, mistakes into insight. Every time I fell off track, I simply returned with more understanding, more compassion, more wisdom than before. The days were beginning to feel less like something to endure and more like something to create. I was waking up with intention, moving with awareness, speaking with care, resting with gratitude. And through it all, I wasn't becoming someone else. I was remembering who I'd always been beneath the noise, the one who had always been enough, the one who just needed space to breathe, to be, to bloom. Something remarkable begins to unfold when your life starts speaking in subtleties instead of shouting in chaos. The clarity that once seemed so far away begins to show up in unexpected places. In a deep exhale, in the stillness between moments, in the way your heart softens toward things you used to fight. There was a shift happening, slowly but surely, in the marrow of my being. I wasn't rushing to become someone anymore. I was starting to feel comfortable in my own skin. Not because I had fixed every broken part, but because I'd finally stopped treating my brokenness like a problem. It wasn't something to hide or repair. It was something to carry, gently, with honor. Like a scar from a battle that shaped me, not shamed me. Mornings were no longer battles between willpower and resistance. They had turned into rituals of return. I'd rise before the world woke up, let the quiet wrap around me, and take that first sip of tea like a promise to myself. Each morning felt like a blank canvas, untouched, full of possibility. And that's where I started to learn something profound. Discipline wasn't about force. It was about devotion, about making space for the life I wanted by honoring it through small acts of care. The act of waking up early, stretching, breathing, writing a few words. It was like building a bridge between the life I had and the life I was growing into. And I was finally beginning to believe that I deserved that life, that it wasn't too much to ask for, that peace wasn't reserved for other people. There were moments when I would look around my space and just breathe differently. The room felt like it held me, not just physically, but emotionally. Clean sheets, soft lighting, a candle burning low in the corner. It felt like the kind of sanctuary I used to crave from the outside world. But now I had built it myself. And in building that sanctuary around me, I began to build one within me. My thoughts weren't at war with each other. My heart didn't feel like a battlefield. There was ease, stillness. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, but alive. Like a field of snow, untouched by footprints. My relationship with time had also changed. I no longer looked at the clock like a judge, measuring my worth by how much I could cram into each hour. I started treating time like a partner, asking it to move with me, not against me. And in that partnership, I found flow. The kind of flow where hours disappear into deep work, where ideas come not from pressure, but from presence. Writing began to pour out of me like water, not because I was trying harder, but because I was finally out of my own way. I had stopped doubting myself at every turn, stopped editing every thought before it had a chance to breathe. I gave myself permission to be messy, to be real, and somehow in that freedom, the clarity I used to chase began chasing me. There were days when I didn't do much, at least not in the way the world measures productivity. I didn't check off a dozen tasks or conquer my goals. I just lived. I sat on the floor for an hour and listened to the rain. I called someone I loved and told them a story. I made a meal from scratch, slow and intentional, letting the scent of garlic and herbs fill the kitchen like a hymn. And those days, those slow, simple days, held more meaning than any packed schedule ever had. Because I was no longer living to impress, I was living to connect, to feel, to be. Old fears still visited sometimes. That voice in the back of my mind that whispered I was falling behind, that I wasn't doing enough. But I had grown strong enough not to believe it. I'd sit with that voice, offer it tea, and ask it what it was really trying to protect me from. And most of the time, it wasn't malice. It was just fear of being forgotten, fear of not mattering. So I reminded myself gently, you matter even when you're still. You matter even when you're not performing. You matter because you are. I had also started journaling in a new way, not just writing about what I did, but about what I felt. I asked myself deeper questions. What did I long for today? What did I avoid? Where did I feel most alive? And through those questions, I discovered parts of myself I didn't know were waiting to be seen. There was a younger version of me buried beneath layers of productivity and people-pleasing. A child who just wanted to create without fear, to love without armor, to dance without judgment. And I was learning how to reparent that child, to say, you're safe now. There was something wildly healing about giving myself space to play again. Not everything had to have a purpose. I started doodling in notebooks just for the joy of it, singing in the shower like no one could hear me, rearranging my furniture because it made the room feel new. These small acts of creativity weren't about outcome. They were about aliveness. And aliveness, I was realizing, is the true measure of a good life. Not how much you achieve, not how many people applaud, but how deeply you feel, how often you laugh, how freely you breathe. I started walking more, without a destination, just letting my feet carry me, through parks, down unfamiliar streets, into bookstores I hadn't noticed before. And in those walks, I found the kind of clarity that doesn't come from thinking, but from moving. My mind, once a tangled web of questions, began to unravel into something softer. I'd come home from those walks not with answers, but with peace. And peace, I'd learned, was enough. Sleep began to feel different too. It wasn't a collapse anymore. It was a return. I would light a candle, take a few deep breaths, and let the day go. I stopped scrolling endlessly at night, stopped feeding my brain noise when it was begging for silence. And in that silence, dreams came back. Vivid, strange, sometimes haunting, but always meaningful. It felt like my subconscious was writing letters to me each night, and I was finally listening. There was a moment one afternoon when I sat outside with a notebook, the sun warming my back, and I wrote, "I'm proud of you." Just that, and I cried, because I realized no one had ever really said that to me in a way that landed. I had waited so long for someone else to validate my journey, to tell me I was doing okay. But in that moment, I became the one I'd been waiting for. And it was enough, more than enough. Because self-love isn't a destination, it's a decision. One you make again and again, especially on the days when it's hardest to believe. The world still moved fast around me. People still posted highlight reels. Deadlines still loomed. But I was rooted now, grounded in a truth that didn't shift with trends. And that truth was this: I am allowed to move at my own pace. I am allowed to live a soft life in a hard world. I am allowed to rest without guilt, to dream without proof, to grow without applause. I had also learned the art of saying no, not from fear, but from clarity. No to invitations that drain me. No to roles I had outgrown. No to expectations that were never mine to carry. And in every no, I carved out space for a deeper yes. Yes to things that aligned. Yes to people who saw me. Yes to paths that felt like home. And that perhaps more than anything else, changed my life. Because when you start choosing what nourishes you instead of what impresses others, you begin to bloom in ways you never thought possible. Evenings became my sacred hours. The golden light spilling through the window, the soft hum of music in the background, the gentle closing of one chapter, and the quiet promise of another. I'd sit with a book or write in silence, letting the day settle into memory. And every now and then, I'd pause and think, this is what peace feels like. Not loud, not flashy, just real, just present, just mine. The journey wasn't perfect, it never would be, but perfection was no longer the goal. Presence was, wholeness was, and I was starting to understand that healing isn't about erasing the pain. It's about integrating it, holding it close, learning from it, letting it shape you into someone softer, wiser, braver, someone who can walk through fire and still smell like lavender, someone who knows how to hold both joy and sorrow in the same breath and call it beautiful. And in all of it, I carried one truth with me like a talisman. I don't have to become someone else to be worthy. I don't have to fix every flaw to be loved. I can be whole and healing, broken and beautiful, a masterpiece and a work in progress all at once. There's something unspeakably powerful about seeing the world through a different lens. When the same streets you used to rush through begin to feel like sacred ground. The trees whisper stories to you. The sky doesn't just exist above you, it cradles you. Even the cracks on the pavement start to look like poetry. And all of this isn't because the world has changed, it's because you have. Your eyes are clearer, your breath is deeper. Your heart, though still bruised, beats with a rhythm that's finally your own. There's no need to mimic anyone else's journey. No more chasing someone else's version of success. You've come home to yourself in ways you never thought possible. Even conversations started to feel more meaningful. I noticed myself listening, not just with my ears, but with my whole being. People weren't just talking anymore. They were revealing. And I wasn't just responding, I was holding space. There was a softness in my replies,